All right, let's read Rambler number 22 for Saturday, June 2nd, 1750. The title of this essay is An Allegory of Wit and Learning. Okay, there's a long bit of Latin there by Horace. I'll skip that. And then here's a quote. Without a genius, learning soars in vain, and without learning, genius sinks again. Their force united crowns the sprightly reign. Elphinson. Wit and learning are the children of Apollo by different mothers. Wit was the offspring of Euphrasia, and resembled her in cheerfulness and vivacity. Learning was born of Sophia, and retained her seriousness and caution. As their mothers were rivals, they were bred up by them from their birth in habitual opposition, and all means were so incessantly employed to impress upon them a hatred and contempt of each other, that though Apollo, who foresaw the ill effects of their discord, endeavored to soften them by dividing his regard equally between them, yet his impartiality and kindness were without effect. The maternal animosity was deeply rooted, having been intermingled with their first ideas, and was confirmed every hour as fresh opportunities occurred of exerting it. No sooner were they of age to be received into the apartments of the other celestials than wit began to entertain Venus at her toilet, by aping the solemnity of learning, and learning to divert Minerva at her loom, by exposing the blunders and ignorance of wit. Thus they grew up, with malice perpetually increasing, by the encouragement which each received from those whom their mothers had persuaded to patronize and support them, and longed to be admitted to the table of Jupiter, not so much for the hope of gaining honor, as of excluding a rival from all pretensions to regard, and of putting an everlasting stop to the progress of that influence which either believed the other to have obtained by mean arts and false appearances. At last the day came when they were both, with their usual solemnities, received into the class of superior deities, and allowed to take nectar from the hand of Hebe. But from that hour Concord lost her authority at the table of Jupiter. The rivals, animated by their new dignity, and incited by the alternate applauses of the associate powers, harassed each other by incessant contests with such a regular vicissitude of victory that neither was depressed. It was observable that at the beginning of every debate the advantage was on the side of wit, and that at the first sallies the whole assembly sparked, according to Homer's expression, with unextinguishable merriment. But learning would reserve her strength till the burst of applause was over, and the languor with which the violence of joy is always succeeded began to promise more calm and patient attention. She then attempted her defense, and, by comparing one part of her antagonist's objections with another, commonly made him confute himself, or, by showing how small a part of the question he had taken into his view, proved that his opinion could have no weight. The audience began gradually to lay aside their prepossessions, and rose at last with great veneration for learning, but with greater kindness for wit. Their conduct was, whenever they desired to recommend themselves to distinction, entirely opposite. Wit was daring and adventurous, learning cautious and deliberate. Wit thought nothing reproachful but dullness. Learning was afraid of no imputation but that of error. Wit answered before he understood, lest his quickness of apprehension should be questioned. Learning paused where there was no difficulty, lest any insidious sophism should lie undiscovered. Wit perplexed every debate by rapidity and confusion. Learning tried the hearers with endless distinctions and prolonged the dispute without advantage by proving that which never was denied. Wit, in hopes of shining, would venture to produce what he had not considered, and often succeeded by his own expectation by following the train of a lucky thought. Learning would reject every new notion for fear of being entangled in consequences which she could not foresee, and was often hindered by her caution from pressing her advantages and subduing her opponent. Both had prejudices which in some degree hindered their progress towards perfection and left them open to attacks. Novelty was the darling of wit, and antiquity of learning. To wit, all that was new was specious. To learning, whatever was ancient was venerable. Wit, however, seldom failed to divert those whom he could not convince, and to convince was not often his ambition. Learning always supported her opinion with so many collateral truths that when the cause was decided against her, her arguments were remembered with admiration. Nothing was more common on either side than to quit their proper characters and to hope for a complete conquest by the use of the weapons which had been employed against them. Wit would sometimes labor a syllogism, and learning distort her features with a jest, but they always suffered by the experiment and betrayed themselves to confutation or contempt. The seriousness of wit was without dignity, and the merriment of learning without vivacity. Their contests by long continuance grew at last important, and the divinities broke into parties. Wit was taken into protection of the laughter-loving Venus, had a retinue allowed him with smiles and jests, and was often permitted to dance among the Graces. Learning still continued the favorite of Minerva, and seldom went out of her palace without a train of the severe virtues, chastity, temperance, fortitude, and labor. Wit cohabitated with Malice, had a son named Satire, who followed him carrying a quiver filled with poisoned arrows, which were they once drew blood, could by no skill ever be extracted. These arrows he frequently shot at Learning, when she was most earnestly and usefully employed, engaged in abstruse inquiries, or giving instructions to her followers. Minerva, therefore, deputed criticism to her aid, who generally broke the point of Satire's arrows, turning them aside or retorted them on himself. Jupiter was at last angry, and that the peace of the heavenly regions should be in perpetual danger of violation, and resolved to dismiss these troublesome antagonists to the lower world. Hither, therefore, they came, and carried on their ancient quarrel among mortals, nor was either long without zealous votaries. Wit, by his gaiety, captivated the young, and Learning, by her authority, influenced the old. Their power quickly appeared by very eminent effects. Theaters were built for the reception of wit, and colleges endowed for the residence of learning. Each party endeavored to outlive the other in cost and magnificence, to outdo the other in cost and magnificence, and to propagate an opinion that it was necessary, from the first entrance into life, to enlist in one of the factions, and none could hope for the regard of either divinity who had once entered the temple of the rival power. There were indeed a class of mortals by whom wit and learning were equally disregarded. These were the devotees of Plutus, the god of riches. Among these it seldom happened that the gaiety of wit could raise a smile, or the eloquence of learning procure attention. In revenge of this contempt, they agreed to incite their followers against them. But the forces that were sent on those expeditions frequently betrayed their trust, and in contempt of the orders which they had received, flattered the rich in public, while they scorned them in their hearts. And when, by this treachery, they had obtained the favor of Plutus, affected to look with an air of superiority on those who still remained in the service of wit and learning. Disgusted with these desertions, the two rivals at the same time petitioned Jupiter for readmission to their native habitations. Jupiter thundered on the right hand, and they prepared to obey the happy summons. Wit readily spread his wings and soared aloft, but not being able to see far, was bewildered in the pathless immensity of the ethereal spaces. Learning, who knew the way, shook her pinions, but for want of natural vigor, could only take short flights. So after many efforts, they both sank again to the ground, and learned from their mutual distress the necessity of union. They therefore joined their hands and renewed their flight. Learning was borne up by the vigor of wit, and wit guided by the perspicacity of learning. They soon reached the dwellings of Jupiter, and were so endeared to each other that they lived afterwards in perpetual concord. Wit persuaded learning to converse with the graces, and learning engaged wit in the service of the virtues. They were now the favorites of all the powers of heaven, and gladdened every banquet by their presence. They soon after married at the command of Jupiter, and had a numerous prodigy of arts and sciences. That was really nice. Really good.